Lee Winksy had exactly $400 of debt against her name, and none of the money to pay it when the men came to collect against her dead husband's memory. She stood in the doorway of the small clapboard house outside Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory, summer heat pressing through her dark hair, and listened to the banker explain, in the patient tone men used when they had already decided a woman's opinion did not matter, that the debt would transfer to whoever agreed to marry her. She was 27, a widow of 11 months, and she had spent every one of those months learning exactly how little a widow's word counted for in a territory where land and law both belonged to men. But the banker had not expected the rancher sitting across the table to say yes before he had finished the sentence. His name was Samuel Corbin, and he owned the largest spread within 40 miles of Dry Creek, 4,000 head of cattle, and a house built of good lumber freighted in from Cheyenne rather than the sod and clapboard most families made do with. He had not come to the bank looking for a wife. He had come to collect on a smaller debt of his own, one that had nothing to do with her, and had found himself instead offered a bargain that solved two problems the town's leading men had been muttering about for weeks: what to do with the widow Winksy, and what to do about Samuel Corbin's empty, silent house since his own wife had died of fever 3 winters past. "She'll be useless to you," the banker said, not unkindly, more as a fact he thought Samuel deserved to know before he signed anything. "Chinese women don't take to ranch work. You'd be feeding a mouth for nothing but the company." He said this while Winksy stood 4 feet away, close enough to hear every word, and did not once look at her while he said it. Samuel Corbin was a broad-shouldered man of 41, with hands scarred rough from 20 years of rope burn and branding iron, a face weathered dark by sun that had nothing gentle left in its lines, and eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale and unreadable. He looked at Winksy for the first time then, a long, unhurried study that felt less like appraisal and more like a man reading a contract he already suspected he would not like the terms of. "I don't need company," he said. "I need someone to keep the house from falling apart around me while I work the herd. If she can't manage that, we'll find out soon enough." He signed the paper without asking her a single question, and that was the moment the whole shape of Winksy's life changed again. The second time in less than a year that a man's signature had decided her future without her consent ever entering into it. She married him 3 days later in front of the territorial clerk, wearing her one good dress, gray wool despite the June heat, and she said her vows in a voice that did not shake, though everything inside her felt like a held breath. Samuel said his own vows the way he might agree to a fair price on cattle, flat and final, and afterward he loaded her single trunk onto the wagon himself without offering his hand to help her up beside it. She noticed that. She noticed everything about him in those first hours, the way she had trained herself to notice things since her husband's death, because a woman with nothing had to survive on observation what other women survived on protection. The ranch house was larger than anything she had lived in since leaving San Francisco as a girl of 9. 2 stories of good lumber with glass windows and a stone chimney, and it was, inside, a wreck of quiet neglect. Dust lay thick on every surface. The kitchen held nothing but tins of hardtack, and a coffee pot burned black on the bottom. A ranch hand named Otis, gray-bearded and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some accident he never explained, showed her to a small bedroom off the back hall and told her, not unkindly, that the boss did not expect much from her, and she should not trouble herself trying to prove different. "I don't intend to prove anything," Wincy said, setting her trunk down herself since no one offered. "I intend to eat something that isn't hardtack, and I expect Mr. Corbin will feel the same way by supper." Otis laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and told her the root cellar still had onions and potatoes from spring planting, and the chicken coop had 6 hens laying poorly from lack of proper feed, and there was a garden gone to weed behind the house that used to belong to the first Mrs. Corbin before the fever took her. Wincy walked out to look at it before she unpacked a single item from her trunk. The soil was good, dark and rich beneath 3 years of neglect, and something in her chest loosened for the first time since the banker's office, because dirt she understood. Dirt did not care what her name sounded like or where her grandparents had been born. It only cared whether you knew how to work it. She spent the rest of that first afternoon walking the whole of the property before she let herself rest, counting what there was to work with the way she had once counted inventory in her husband's failing store, out of a habit that had kept them fed longer than his own optimism ever had. She found a smokehouse gone unused, its hooks rusted but sound. She found a root cellar deeper and cooler than the one at her old house, big enough to keep a winter's worth of preserves. She found behind the barn a stand of wild plum trees heavy with fruit nobody had thought to pick, and she filled her apron with as much as it would hold before the light failed, because waste was a sin she had learned young and never unlearned. By the time Samuel came in from the range that evening, dust caked into the creases of his hands and shirt soaked through with a day's labor, he expected to find the same empty silence that had greeted him every evening for 3 years. Instead, the smell reached him before he was through the door, ginger and garlic and something rich simmering low, and he stopped in the doorway of his own kitchen the way a man stops when he has walked into the wrong house by mistake. Wincy stood at the stove, sleeves rolled past her elbows, stirring a pot of stew thick with potatoes and the last of a rabbit Otis had shot that afternoon, seasoned with dried ginger she had carried in her trunk all the way from her husband's failed store, along with a skillet of cornbread she had coaxed from flour so old it had nearly weevilled through. She did not turn around immediately. She had learned that, too, in 11 months of widowhood, that a woman who turned too fast toward a man's arrival looked like she was seeking his approval, and she had decided somewhere on the wagon ride out that she would not seek Samuel Corbin's approval for anything. "You cook," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I eat," she said, "and I prefer to eat well. You're welcome to sit down before it's cold." He sat. He did not say another word until he had finished a full plate and was reaching, without asking, for a second helping of cornbread, and when he finally spoke again his voice had lost some of the flat finality it carried at the clerk's office. "The banker told me you'd be useless out here." "The banker has never once been right about anything in his life," Wincy said, "including the weather, which he predicts wrong every single Sunday from the porch of his own bank." She said it without heat, simply stating a fact, and something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved briefly at the corner of Samuel's mouth before he caught it and put it away again, the way a man puts away money he isn't ready to spend. That was the moment Samuel Corbin understood he had married a stranger about whom he knew nothing true, and that the nothing he had assumed about her was going to cost him more in wrongness than he had bargained for. The weeks that followed proved the banker wrong in ways the whole of Dry Creek eventually had to reckon with. When she cleared the garden herself, working before dawn while the heat was bearable, and within a month had beans climbing new stakes and squash spreading thick green leaves across ground that had been bare dirt when she arrived. She fixed the chicken coop's broken latch with a hinge Otis had been meaning to replace for a year, and the hens, better fed on kitchen scraps and proper grain, began laying eggs enough to sell surplus at the mercantile in town. She kept books, too, in careful English she had learned as a girl alongside her native tongue, and discovered within her first month that Samuel's foreman had been shorting the feed order by nearly a fifth every month and pocketing the difference, a theft Samuel had suspected but never proven until when she laid the numbers out on the kitchen table one evening and showed him exactly where the columns failed to add. He fired the foreman the next morning in front of the assembled ranch hands and did not explain to any of them how he had known. But that night at supper he set down his fork and looked at her the way he had not looked at anyone since his first wife died, careful and searching, as though trying to see past a wall he had built himself. "Where did you learn numbers like that?" he said. "My husband kept a store," Winshee said. "He was not a careful man. Someone had to be, or we would have starved before the debt ever came due." She said it plainly, no bitterness reaching her voice, though something in her eyes when she said husband made Samuel look away first, uncomfortable in a way he could not have named. The smokehouse became her project through the second month, and she cured the first side of venison Otis brought in with a mix of salt and the last of her dried spices, hanging it slow over hickory smoke the way her mother had taught her before the ocean crossing, before San Francisco, before any of the losses that had brought her to this particular kitchen in this particular territory. Samuel watched her work it one evening without saying anything, leaning in the smokehouse doorway with his arms crossed, and when she finally noticed him there, he only said that his first wife had tried to smoke meat exactly once and burned down half a fence doing it, and that watching Winshee do it right, unhurried and certain, was the closest thing to peaceful he had felt on this ranch in longer than he wanted to admit. But Dry Creek did not surrender its assumptions as easily as Samuel had. The town had opinions about a rich rancher taking a Chinese widow to wife instead of one of the eligible daughters of its better families, and those opinions found voice most sharply in Constance Whitford, wife of the town's largest landowner, who made a point that summer of steering conversation away from Winshee whenever she appeared at the mercantile, of speaking slowly and loudly as though volume might overcome a language barrier that did not exist. Winshee bore it with the same flat patience she had learned to bear everything, and did not give Constance Whitford the satisfaction of a reaction, though it cost her something each time, a small private toll she paid alone in the wagon on the ride home. One Sunday in July, the toll came due more visibly than usual. Winshee had brought a basket of her canned plum preserves to sell at the church social, the same wild plums she had gathered her first afternoon on the ranch, and Constance Whitford made a show of examining the jars before setting them back down without buying, remarking to the woman beside her, just loud enough to carry, that she wondered whether food prepared by foreign hands agreed with a decent stomach. Winksy said nothing. She packed her jars back into the basket with steady hands, and it was Otis, of all people, gray-bearded and gruff and unbothered by town opinion, who stepped forward and bought every last jar himself, loud enough for half the churchyard to hear, declaring that he had eaten better food in that kitchen in 3 months than in the previous 3 years combined, and that any fool who turned down good preserves over foolishness about hens deserved whatever bland supper waited for them at home. It did not silence Constance Whitford. But it was the first time Winksee understood that not everyone in Dry Creek had already decided who she was before she arrived. The real trouble arrived at the end of July, when a grass fire started along the eastern fence line during a dry spell that had left the whole territory brittle as kindling. Nobody ever proved for certain whether it started from a careless traveler's cooking fire or from something more deliberate, though Otis muttered privately that the timing, 2 days after Samuel had refused to sell water rights to a neighboring rancher named Whitford's own brother, seemed convenient in a way he did not trust. The fire moved fast through dry summer grass, and it moved toward the herd's summer pasture, 4,000 head of cattle standing between flame and the safety of the river beyond. Every hand on the ranch turned out to fight it, beating at the fire line with wet sacks and shovels of dirt, and Winksee was among them before anyone thought to tell her to stay back in the house where a woman belonged. She had grown up watching her father fight brush fires outside San Francisco, and she knew, better than most of the young hands panicking at the size of the flame, that fighting fire meant working the edges, not the center, cutting off its path rather than trying to smother the whole of it at once. "The wind's turning," she shouted at Samuel, who was fighting the main line with the desperate strength of a man watching his life's work threatened. "It'll push north in a few minutes, toward the creek bend. If we cut a break there now, ahead of it, we can starve it before it reaches the herd." He looked at her for one long second through smoke and heat, a man deciding whether to trust a stranger's read on a danger he thought he understood better than anyone alive. And then he nodded, sharp and final, and shouted the change in orders to the other hands. They cut the brake exactly where she said the wind would push the fire, and 20 minutes later, when the wind did turn precisely as she predicted, the flame ran hard into bare cut ground and had nowhere left to travel. The herd survived, the house survived, and Samuel Corbin stood afterward in a field gone black and smoking at the edges, staring at the woman he had married for the flattest and most practical of reasons, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only after real danger has passed, that he had gotten something in this bargain he had not paid for and did not deserve. That night, after the smoke had cleared and the hands had finally gone to their bunks exhausted, Samuel found Wink C on the back porch, her hands still black with soot, staring out at the ruined field lit silver under a rising moon. He sat beside her without asking, close enough that she could feel the heat still radiating off him from the day's labor, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. "My first wife," he said finally, "used to sit right here every evening, before she got sick. I haven't sat on this porch since she died. Couldn't stand to." "Why tonight?" Winksy said. "Because tonight I finally had a reason to." He turned to look at her, and his voice, when it came again, had none of the flatness it had carried at the clerk's office. "I told the banker I didn't need company. I told myself the same thing for 3 years. I was wrong about both. I just didn't have the sense to know it until a woman I married for a debt saved my whole herd with nothing but good sense and a read on the wind." "I didn't do it for you," Wincy said, honest in the way she had decided, somewhere in the last month, she owed him. "I did it because I have learned that when everything is taken from you once, you fight twice as hard to keep whatever you're given a second chance to hold on to. This ranch, this kitchen, it's the first thing that's felt like mine since my husband died, and I wasn't about to watch it burn without a fight." Something in Samuel's face went very still at that, and then, slowly, he reached over and took her soot-blackened hand in his own scarred one, an act so small and so enormous that Wincy felt it travel through her whole body like a struck match. "I'd like it to be yours," he said, "not because of a debt, because I've watched you build something out of nothing here that I couldn't build in 3 years alone, and I'd be a fool to let pride keep me from saying so." She did not answer him with words. She let her hand stay in his, and that, on a porch scorched at the edges by fire they had beaten back together, was answer enough for both of them. But Constance Whitford was not finished making her opinions known, and the second danger of that summer arrived not as flame, but as paper. Wincy discovered it herself, going through the ranch's filed deeds one August afternoon while Samuel was out with the herd. A discrepancy in the water rights document Constance's own brother-in-law had filed against the eastern boundary. A forged signature claiming Samuel had sold rights he had never agreed to part with. It was, she realized with a cold drop in her stomach, precisely the kind of legal maneuver that could strip a rancher of half his water access before he ever saw it coming, filed quietly through a territorial clerk's office while everyone's attention was still fixed on the fire's aftermath. She rode into town herself to confront it, something no woman in Dry Creek would have dared alone, and found the territorial clerk, a nervous young man named Foster Price, unwilling to meet her eyes when she laid the forged document on his desk beside a sample of Samuel's real signature from their marriage certificate. "These don't match," she said, flat and certain. "You know they don't match. I'd like to know who paid you to file it anyway." Foster Price did not confess outright, not that day, but the fear in his face told her everything the paper hadn't. And when Samuel arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a boy Wincy had sent running for him, the weight of an angry rancher standing over a nervous clerk did what Wincy's calm insistence alone had not quite managed. Foster admitted, stammering, that Constance Whitford's brother-in-law had paid him $20 to file the forged rights transfer, banking on nobody checking the paperwork until the water was already claimed and impossible to reverse. The confrontation that followed happened in the open street, in front of half the town, when Samuel walked directly to the Whitford house and laid the forged document on their porch table with a fury he had not shown anyone in years. "You tried to steal water rights out from under me while my hands were still black from fighting a fire that started on my land 2 days after I refused to sell to your brother," he said, loud enough for neighbors to hear from their own porches. "I don't know if you set that fire. I can't prove it. But I can prove this forgery, and I will see it undone in front of the territorial judge if it takes every dollar I have." It did not take every dollar. It took 3 weeks and one furious hearing in front of a circuit judge who rode through Dry Creek twice a year, and Wincy herself testified before that judge, laying out the mismatched signatures and the timeline of the forged filing with the same calm precision she had used to catch the thieving foreman, until even the judge, a weathered man who had heard every excuse the territory had to offer, remarked that he wished more witnesses came before him with her clarity. At the end of it, Foster Price lost his clerkship, the Whitford family paid a settlement that stung enough to humble them in public for the first time in a decade, and Samuel's water rights returned to him whole and unquestioned. Constance Whitford did not apologize, not in so many words, but she stopped steering conversation away from Wincy at the mercantile after that, and something had shifted in the town's collective accounting of who the Corbin Ranch actually belonged to and who had fought hardest to keep it standing. September brought a different kind of test, quieter than fire and paper, but no less telling. A traveling peddler passed through Dry Creek with bolts of good cloth and tins of tea, and among his wares was a small, carved wooden box with a lid that did not quite sit flush, the sort of imperfect, handmade thing nobody else at the mercantile gave a second glance. Wincy bought it without haggling, more money than it was worth, and would not explain to Samuel why until that evening, when she set it on the kitchen table and told him it reminded her of a box her mother had kept dried ginger root in, back before the crossing, back before any of it. It was a small admission, the kind she had not offered anyone in 11 months of widowhood, and Samuel understood, watching her turn the box over in her hands, that he was being shown something he had not earned yet and needed to be careful with. He did not press her for more. He only said that the box looked like it belonged on the kitchen shelf next to the tins, and Wincy set it there that same night, and it stayed. October arrived, and with it the first hard frost warning Otis had seen in years this early in the season. A cold snap that dropped without mercy 2 weeks before anyone on the ranch had finished bringing in the last of the harvest. Wincy woke before dawn to the smell of ice in the air and roused the whole house herself, working alongside Samuel and Otis and the remaining hands through a bitter, driving morning to strip the garden of everything still worth saving before the frost could claim it, her hands raw and cracked from cold soil, her breath fogging in the gray half-light. They lost some of the late squash. They saved nearly everything else, and it was Wincy who thought to cover the young fruit trees with burlap sacking before the worst of the cold set in, a trick she remembered from her father's small orchard outside San Francisco. And those trees, Otis remarked afterward, stood a better chance now of surviving to bear fruit again than they had any right to expect after such a hard season. Autumn came slow and gold across the territory after that. And 3 months after the fire, the Corbin Ranch looked like nothing the banker had predicted the day he called Wink C useless. The garden had produced enough surplus to can 2 full cellars worth of vegetables against winter. The hens, properly tended, had doubled their laying and were bringing in steady coin at the mercantile every week. The smokehouse hung heavy with cured meat enough to see the whole ranch through to spring. The herd, saved once from fire and once from illegal theft neither man nor law had caught in time, had grown fat on autumn grass, and Otis had taken to telling anyone who would listen in town that the missus had more sense in her little finger than most ranch foremen carried in their whole skulls. Samuel found Wincy in the kitchen on a cool October evening, the smell of cinnamon and dried apple filling the whole downstairs from a pie cooling on the window-sill, and he stood in the doorway the way he had that first night, though everything about the moment had turned itself inside out since then. "The banker came by the mercantile today," he said. "Asked after you. Said he'd heard the ranch was doing better than it had in years." "What did you tell him?" Wincy said, not turning from the stove, though she was smiling now in a way she would not have allowed herself that first summer evening. "I told him," Samuel said, crossing the kitchen to stand beside her, "that he'd been wrong about you from the very first day, and that I was the luckiest fool in this territory for signing a paper I didn't understand the value of until it was already too late to change my mind, and that I wouldn't change it now even if I could." He took her hand, flour-dusted and warm from the oven, and there was nothing flat or final in his voice anymore, only something that had taken all summer and all autumn to earn its way into being said plainly. "I love you, Wincy. Not because of the debt, and not because of what you've built out here, because of who you are underneath all of it, which I very nearly missed the chance to know." She did not answer with a speech. She reached up and touched the rough, weathered line of his jaw, the same hand that had cut fire breaks and caught forgeries and coaxed a garden from 3 years of neglect, and let that be answer enough, the way it always had been between them, built from action rather than declaration. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.